Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that a ceasefire proposal from the terrorist group Hamas was delusional and would invite an additional slaughter of Israelis in the future. He said all this in a press conference last night. Well, joining me to discuss this is Jake Wallis-Simons. He's editor of the Jewish Chronicle and a former foreign correspondent as well, and author of the very brilliant book Israelophobia. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, Jake.
Thank you for having me.
I'm just going to go through exactly what those proposals are, because we know that we had proposals that were put together. Again, I do find it extraordinary that so much of this is being put together by Qatar when they are harbouring Hamas and other terrorists. But there we are. They seem to be the peace brokers in the Middle East at the moment. But their proposals went to the Israelis, and it appeared that they were willing to sign up to various proposals. And then they went to Hamas, and Hamas came back with these demands. Basically, phase one, a 45-day pause in fighting, during which all Israeli women hostages, males under 19, the elderly and sick, would be exchanged for Palestinian women and children. We often mean children, we mean 16, 17, 18-year-olds held in Israeli jails. Also, that Israeli forces would withdraw from all populated areas of Gaza completely, and hospitals and refugee camps reconstruction would begin. Phase two, remaining male Israeli hostages would be exchanged for Palestinian prisoners, and Israeli forces would leave Gaza completely. And phase three, both sides would exchange both the remains and the bodies of either side. The key issue here is the withdrawal of IDF forces completely from Gaza, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, what Hamas's demands amount to really are please let us live. Please let us continue to exist. We'll give you back your hostages if you give us our continued existence. And the implications of that for Israel would be that Hamas would then have the opportunity to mount another October the 7th in the future, precipitating an even worse war. So that is intolerable. But also, I think it would mean that a two-state solution, which people in Britain and in the international community are so keen to see at the moment, would be impossible, because of course you cannot have a two-state solution with Hamas. Hamas don't believe in the two-state solution. They believe in a one-state solution, i.e. their jihadist state with no Jews in it at all. And so from the point of view of the international community, people need to start thinking, if you're calling for a ceasefire and the continued existence of Hamas, what you're then saying is, we're not up for a two-state solution. We're not supporting a two-state solution. If you are supporting a two-state solution, you need to get behind Netanyahu's idea of total victory. Hamas has got to be got rid of before any meaningful negotiations towards a two-state solution can take place. You can't have it both ways.
Well, this phrase total victory, and it's something you talked about in that press conference yesterday as well. You know, that means the complete destruction of Hamas, all of their capabilities, the tunnels across the whole of Gaza, north, not just in Gaza City. I mean, you know, IDF forces have gone into Rafah, the southernmost city we've heard, you know, near that border with Egypt. But total victory involves, you know, destruction. I mean, I think he's claimed something like the deaths of about a third of Hamas fighters, or the capture of another 20,000, though still. Apparently still available to fight in Gaza. The cost of achieving that so-called total victory is huge on the civilian population. And we know already Western governments, particularly America, are pulling back from that support for Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's right of self-defense. Everyone pays lip service to that. What it actually means in purpose, in practicality or reality, is that total victory. But Western allies are not going to support that. So how is he going to achieve that?
Well, I think there are a few things to say there. I mean, first of all, you're right that a high number of civilians have been killed, but proportionately to the number of combatants who were killed, Israel's performance has been no different to the performance of Britain or the United States in urban theatre. Indeed, better that they're facing. But the other thing is that Israel, of course, is going to move, and it has begun to move towards a lower intensity phase of the war, with a much smaller military footprint on the ground, based more on smaller counterinsurgency incursions, with the ability to mount major, but that wouldn't be the main default setting as it has been in the past. And you might have noticed that the rate of civilian casualties has come down dramatically since the new year began. It's high, but it hasn't increased very much in that period. And also, the final point I would make is that, yes, civilian casualties are high, or higher than anybody we would like them to be, The reason is because creating civilian casualties is part of Hamas's strategy to turn the minds of the West against Israel. And in the bigger picture, if Hamas, destroying Hamas is going to involve civilian casualties because of the way that Hamas operates.
Yeah.
If you don't do it now, you're making the problem greater for down the road. Hamas has been open about the fact it wishes to carry out October the 7th again and again and again. Sooner or later, Hamas cannot continue to exist. It must be abolished and destroyed. If not now, then later on, and many more lives will be cost in the meantime.
Is there an element where actually an awful lot of Western governments are actually secretly perfectly happy with what Israel is doing, but they're having to pay lip service because there's been this huge outcry? Look, completely understand it. I mean, I'm called a genocidal... I can't even use half the words that I'm accused of on social media, and I'm sure you are as well. No ways. A, it's not genocide, it's war. Those are two different things. We have different words for these things for a reason. And B, no one in their right mind would think it's ever acceptable for any innocent person, certainly a child, to be killed in a conflict of this sort. However, it is Hamas's choice. They chose this with what they did on October the 7th. They knew this would be the outcome, but they've also chosen to make sure that they hide their, as you say, their infrastructure underneath civilian infrastructures. We've seen in entrance to tunnels and weaponry kept in children's bedrooms and in residential apartment buildings, in hospitals, in schools. We've seen this again and again. They do a good propaganda game, but most right-thinking people are nevertheless, Jake, horrified by the scale of deaths of innocent people, particularly children, in Palestine. In Gaza. Can anything be done, though? You said it's come down, but can anything more be done to prevent that loss of life?
I mean, you're absolutely right that, while other countries wage war, the Jews apparently wage genocide. People in Britain didn't take to the streets when we smashed Islamic State because we understood the threat and what needed to be done. And the civilians that were killed in our operation didn't suffer any more gruesome a death than those killed in the Israeli operation at the moment. Look, having said that, of course, you're absolutely right. It's horrendous to see even one child dying in war, let alone so many, because of Hamas putting them in harm's way and precipitating this war with their gruesome October the 7th attacks. And yes, Israel is doing a lot more than any other country in history to reduce civilian casualties, despite what Hamas is doing, whether it's leaflet drops or millions of automatic phone calls and texts telling people to leave the blast zone and so forth. We all know about that. If more can be done, I'm confident that the IDF will do it, but the reduction in the intensity of the conflict and the more pinpoint operations we see, hopefully will help to reduce those very horrendous civilian casualties as well. Yeah. But I think ultimately we mustn't lose sight of the fact that this is Hamas's war. It was waged because Hamas carried out those atrocities on Israelis. And Hamas is part of a broader jihadi threat that threatens us here in Britain. We've had suicide bombs in Manchester and elsewhere, as well as the rest of the democratic world. It's a war on our freedom. Israel is fighting it in the front lines, but the fight is coming to us if it isn't stopped. And so it does need to be sooner or later.
Indeed, there's a point, that's been made many times in recent weeks when, global feeling has changed. In terms of the hostages, there was some talk that possibly up to 30 of the 130 hostages believed to still be being held by Hamas may already be dead. The concern is getting these hostages back, particularly the concern, and we spoke to the families of 4 of the hostages in recent weeks, that particularly the decision by Hamas they sent back a lot of children and elderly women, but actually young women, women in their 20s, they largely kept hold of those women. Big concerns about the horrors that those women and other hostages, men as well, will be undergoing right now. Do we have any hope at all that those hostages are going to be found by the IDF as opposed to released by Hamas?
I mean, so far there's only really been one Israeli hostage who's been saved by an IDF raid. That was quite early in the war, a female soldier. There have been another couple who've been killed by the Israelis while trying to rescue them in the firefight that ensued. And so in terms of actual hostage rescues, the record isn't brilliant so far. And yet, Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, has made clear that the strategy is to increase military pressure on Hamas until they give up hostages. And that has been shown to have worked. The hostages release that we saw a few months back came as a result of intense Israeli military pressure, and far fewer Palestinians were released in return than had happened in the past, when more than 1,000 were released for Gilad Shalit, if you remember, some years ago. So I think military pressure is the answer, sadly. It's the answer that Netanyahu laid out very, very clearly last night. And just to your point previously about powers around the world secretly rooting for Israel more than they say they do, that's definitely the case in the Arab world. The Saudis and other Gulf powers, even the Egyptians, have no love for Hamas at all. Hamas has fought the Egyptian army in Egypt during the Arab Spring. They want Hamas gone. They don't really care how Israel does it, to be honest, to some extent. Their outward statements to the international community are rather different than their private feelings. Everybody does want Hamas gone. Everyone should want Hamas gone. And that's the only real solution to this problem.
Indeed. I do think the people who are marching every Saturday on our streets in the UK calling about the concerns for the Palestinian civilians, all of their placards should say, get rid of Hamas. That would be the #1 thing that would actually help those people. Jake Wallis-Simons.
Hamas.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us. He's the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, foreign correspondent.